so much for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here back in the Leicester area. I've enjoyed having a little look round this afternoon, looking at some old familiar haunts, and that's been great. It's been great to do that. So is the microphone okay? Okay. Hopefully you can all hear me then. That's wonderful. So my name is Paul Taylor, and I'm the director of the Mount St. Helens Creation Centre. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Mount St. Helens and why it's so interesting to us. Now, straight up, I need to tell you that I believe in God's Word. I believe God's Word is true from the very first verse. And one of the fascinating things about Mount St. Helens, and in particular about the eruption that happened, the big eruption that happened in 1980, is that many of the things that happened are not what were expected by people who believe that geology takes millions of years. You'll find that we have things that happened at Mount St. Helens that cannot be explained in an evolutionary timescale, but can be explained in a biblical timescale. So those are the sort of things that I want to tell you about over the next 2.5 hours or so. Don't worry, it won't really be 2.5 hours, okay? It'll just seem like it. Okay, let me show you first of all our little promotional video that tells you a little bit about our ministry. What happened at this mountain in 1980? And why are we, as a biblically based ministry, interested in what happened here? What does it tell us about what happened at the time of the worldwide flood? The landscape here was changed catastrophically, in some cases in a matter of minutes. Sediment was laid down in a matter of hours. Canyons were formed in hours. And in a matter of months or years, wildlife came back to the area. Areas that scientists thought would never be repopulated were repopulated. What we see here in miniature is exactly the sort of thing that must have happened at the time of the worldwide flood. See things for yourself and find out about the wonderful truth of God's Word. Well, that's like a little taster of a DVD that we have produced recently about our ministry, and it really takes you on a virtual excursion. So if you think you're never going to be able to get over to the Pacific Northwest of the United States, then we've got a DVD that might help you. It's on DVD, or it's available as a video download from our website. So let me tell you a little bit about Mount St. Helens and give you a bit of a taste today for what it's about. It's a beautiful place to be. When you look at a scene like this, you can see that it is beautiful. There's the mountain with the snow and the glaciers on it, and you've got this marvelous area here with the trees, little streams flowing, little ponds. It's just a beautiful place to be. And yet that countryside was completely devastated. If you had been stood where this photograph was taken at the end of 1980, all that area in the middle and foreground of the photograph would be completely devastated. It was all life was wiped out everywhere, and the top of the mountain was blown off completely. There is a crater there that is over a mile wide. I often get asked, where were you when the mountain blew? Well, I can tell you where I was when the mountain blew. I was at Nottingham University taking my degree in chemistry. That's a very long time ago. I know some of you here are far too young to remember 1980, and you're far too young to remember the idea of chemistry in 1980. Things have changed since then, because I understand they're no longer trying to turn lead into gold there anymore. But I did that degree at that time, and I remember there being on the news this account of a bad eruption in Washington State, but it didn't register. After all, it was something happening a very long way away. Why would it register in my brain? I don't remember a great deal about it from then. But I had been saved. I was saved at the age of 15. I was involved in Christian groups at the university, and when I left the university and became a school teacher, I was a school teacher for 20 years in comprehensive schools around the country, first in Manchester and then in South Wales. And I was also involved in creation ministry of different types with different groups. And at one time I was part of a group in the early 1980s called the Biblical Creation Society. I was on the executive committee of that group. And one day somebody came along to one of our meetings and said, you know, what happened at Mount St. Helens in 1980 is very interesting to us creationists. Things have happened there that are similar to things that must have happened at the time of the worldwide flood. That was about 1984. Since 1984, I've been very interested in Mount St. Helens. But I had no idea then that I was ever going to be able to see Mount St. Helens, let alone be able to operate a ministry there. So it's a wonderful privilege to be able to be there at Mount St. Helens. Well, this is what Mount St. Helens looked like before May the 18th, 1980. You could see that it was a beautiful mountain. And I've been able to get hold of that photograph from the National Geographic website. And that photograph was actually taken on May the 17th, 1980. So in less than 24 hours, that scenery was going to be changed forever. It was a very beautiful mountain. It was a very beautiful place to go. People loved it there. And I have to say, living in that area, when I speak to local people, it does stir up a number of emotions in them. There are some people who are still very emotional about it today. I show people a house that was partly buried in mud, which was occupied in 1980 by a couple who I've since come to know very well. They were a young married couple in 1980. And the gentleman concerned, who was an elder of a church that I used to be part of, called Gary, and when Gary very graciously agreed to come and be interviewed by a Christian school group at our centre, and one of the students asked him, what was it like when you heard that your house had been demolished? Which hadn't really been demolished, it had just been filled with volcanic mud. What was it like? Well, he explained what it was like, what happened, and then suddenly as he spoke, he choked up. And he started to cry, and then he got a grip on himself, and he carried on talking, and he said, no, I need to carry on talking. Afterwards, he came to me, and he apologized. He said, I'm sorry, I broke down at that point. I was very weak. I said, no, I think those kids needed to hear that. That 37 years on, because it was last year he did that interview, 37 years on, the emotions still run there, even among God's people who know, and those events led Gary to ultimately to eventually come to know the Lord. Well, where is Mount St. Helens then? There's a map of the United States, and what you have to do is you have to look up to the top left-hand corner. In the top left-hand corner is a state called Washington. Now, this is very confusing because Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, is over on the right-hand side there, on the east coast. But Washington State is the top left-hand state there. Why on earth they did that like that, I don't know, but that is where I live, in that state. So if we go in a little bit closer, there's Washington State, and you'll see that Washington State here, this square here is in there's two main plain areas. There's an area close to the coast there. Then up to the northwest of the state is the Olympic National Park, the Olympic Mountains. That is all covered with rainforest. There's temperate rainforest in that area, very wild. Then you've got the Cascade Mountains, which are full of volcanoes here. Mount St. Helens is not the only volcano in the area. In fact, the volcanoes extend all the way down to northern California, down there through Oregon to northern California. Then there's a plain, a desert area to the east of the state over the mountains before you get to the Rocky Mountains. Those are the Rocky Mountains there. Washington State, like all other states in the United States, is divided into counties. So there are the counties of Washington State. Mount St. Helens is actually just inside Skamania County, but I live in Cowlitz County, and this is where we approach the area, because if you're going to come and visit Mount St. Helens, you will always come through Cowlitz County. That's the main entrance into the area. So that's where we really start our journey. And where we're going to start our journey looking at Mount St. Helens is starting again with what the mountain looked like before the eruption and what actually happened to it then at the time of the eruption. Well, it was May the 18th, 1980, which was a Sunday. And the time is 8:32 a.m. in the morning, 8:32 in the morning. And a photographer called Gary Rosenquist, standing at a place called Bear Meadow to the northeast of the volcano, noticed that the mountain was shimmering. He had set up his camera ready to take a number of photographs, and it was a mechanically operated camera. They didn't have the digital cameras in those days. Okay, it was a mechanically operated camera. It was going to take 30 photographs per minute, because it was automatically done. Since then, those photographs have been taken and have been, by modern technology, have been merged to make a film showing what happened. So here we are, 8:32 in the morning. There was a 5.1 magnitude earthquake that loosened the whole of the north face of the volcano, which fell at a speed of 150 miles per hour into the valley below. That released the pressure behind so that the blast occurred. The volcanic blast happened at a speed of 300 miles per hour. So it very quickly overtook the landslide. The landslide kept on moving, but the blast moved faster and with a great deal of power, with the force of 1,000 atomic bombs the size of that dropped in Hiroshima. When it hit the trees, therefore, it snapped those trees as if they were matchsticks. It was just a devastating force. There's a piece of real film there of the cloud. Now, this animation is showing you a lake close to Mount St. Helens called Spirit Lake. The landslide came into the lake, and it pushed all the water out of the lake 800 feet up the hillside opposite. Now, the blast had already knocked down all the trees. Trees were knocked down by the blast up to 17 miles away from the volcano. 17 miles to the north of the volcano, trees were knocked down. 230 square miles of old-growth forest that must have been there for centuries was completely flattened, completely obliterated. And the lake or the water of the lake had been pushed up the hillside 800 feet where all the trees had already been knocked down. Then the water came back down the hill again 500 feet down. And the difference of 300 feet is because the landslide had filled in where the lake used to be to a depth of 300 feet. So the water came back down on top of the landslide. So the lake looks on a map as if it's in the same place that it used to be. But it isn't. It's 300 feet further, higher up in a vertical direction. All the houses and campsites and hotels that used to be round the lake, called Spirit Lake, they are not at the bottom of the lake, as some people think. They are 300 feet below the bottom of the lake, and nobody has dug them out. And that's where they are. Now, before the eruption, the mountain used to be 9,677 feet, and this is the north side of the volcano. And between the volcano and this ridge where the photograph was taken was a very steep-sided valley. Very deep valley, V-shaped valley, covered with this old-growth forest. This ridge didn't really have a name in 1980. When the geologists came to the area, they decided that they were going to be based at Washington State University in Vancouver, Washington. There's another Vancouver, less well known than Vancouver, British Columbia, the southern end of Washington State, just across the river from Portland, Oregon, is Vancouver, Washington. That's where they set up their base, but they put a trailer basically like a bit like a caravan, on top of this ridge as a base, and geologists took it in turn to be on that ridge so that they could watch the volcano, because after all they were 5 miles away from the volcano. That ridge is 5 miles from the volcano. Everybody knows that volcanoes erupt upwards, right? So they were going to be perfectly safe. Now the geologist on duty on the night of May the 17th, 1980, was called Dr. David Johnston. He was a young man, 29 years old. He and his wife had 2 small children. Of course, as we now know, the volcano did not erupt upwards. It erupted sideways, straight out of the north face of the volcano. The blast hit the ridge with that full force. David Johnston was killed almost immediately. He had just enough time to radio through to the base to say, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it, and then he was killed. That ridge is now known as Johnston Ridge. And if you go to that area, if you come on one of our excursions in the area, we will end the excursion at the Johnston Ridge Observatory, which has been built to observe the volcanic crater at more or less the same point. Late in 1980, this is what the volcano would have looked like. You can see there, this photograph is taken from more or less the same point. So you can see that all the forest has gone, buried or obliterated or incinerated. The valley has gone as well, filled in to a depth of 600 feet by volcanic debris. The river had gone. There was a river down at the bottom of the valley. That was completely blocked up by the volcanic eruption. And of course you can see that half the mountain had gone. The new height of the mountain is 8,364 feet, which means that it's lost 1,313 feet, okay? Just waiting to see if some of you can do some elementary maths. You know, I do that with school groups when I have school groups in. About 2 out of every 3 school groups that I have in, it's the teachers who answer the question for me instead of the students. They obviously think their students can't do simple subtraction. Anyway, 1,313 feet has been lost. You can see that there's a huge amount of material lost from the middle of the mountain as well. Early in 1980, this photograph was taken in March 1980, they knew something was going to happen because a large bulge was growing on the north side of the volcano. Seen from below the volcano, there's this huge bulge growing. At one point, it was growing 5 feet a day. And there it was, looking like a pimple on the face of a teenager. And in the same way, it was going to have to burst. Perhaps that wasn't a very good analogy. But it was certainly going to have to burst. It was building up a lot of pressure. Well, the reason for that is, is because Mount St. Helens is a stratovolcano. A stratovolcano. Now, everybody knows 2 facts about volcanoes, don't they? Everybody knows that volcanoes are cone-shaped and that they send out lava that flows all the way across the countryside. Is that right? We know those 2 facts. Actually, those 2 facts are mutually exclusive. The volcanoes which are cone-shaped do not spew out lava that go across the countryside. They are explosive. As we'll see in a minute, they are destructive volcanoes. That is an area where the crust is being destroyed. The volcanoes that do spew out lava that travel slowly like hot treacle across the countryside are shield volcanoes. They're in areas like in Hawaii where new earth crust is being created. That's not the case here. The lava is actually very thick and you can see that it's going to come up and it's just going to pour out and not travel very far. It simply makes a new layer. So these volcanoes are like ogres. They have layers. Because of the way that the lava flows out and then just sets, it doesn't go very far. But once the volcano had erupted at Mount St. Helens, and perhaps actually if I just go back, I ought to say, just to spoil that picture a moment, I will just go back. But what I should point out on this picture is that presumably the crater at the top of the volcano in 1980 was so plugged up with lava, with solidified lava, that it could not be pushed out by the pressure coming up. And there were plenty of side vents. So this is why you got this, the bulge appearing on the side of the volcano, and that's why the volcano erupted sideways. Of course, we have seen that effect since then. In the 1990s, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in the same way. We now know that many other volcanoes around the world must have erupted in similar ways in the past. But once the volcano had erupted, this is what the forest looked like on all the hillsides around the volcano. Those little twigs lying there on the ground, tiny little twigs are lying around on the ground. Well, they're not little twigs. They are huge, enormous, mature Douglas fir trees, just lying around, snapped as if they were just little matchsticks. What happened in the area then is, this is Mount St. Helens. There's the peak of the mountain as it would have been. So you got the blast, and you got lots of heat, and you got some hot lava coming out, and you got landslides going northwards. But the heat melted the glaciers. There are lots of glaciers around the mountain. There still are today. There's still a glacier here called the Toutle Glacier. On the west of the mountain. There were, the biggest glacier was on the south side, called the Shoestring Glacier. When these melted, the water picked up lots of mud, and you've got these enormous mud flows then flowing down the mountainside, down these rivers. Fortunately, these reservoirs here, they knew the mountain was going to erupt. They'd had about 3 months warning of the rumblings. They didn't know it was going to erupt as explosively as it did, but they guessed there were going to be mud flows, so they lowered these reservoirs by about 20 feet, and that saved the dams, so they didn't have a problem on the south side. But on the west side, you've got mud flows coming down the South Fork Toutle River. The Toutle River is made of two forks, one there. There's the North Fork, South Fork, and they join together at the town called Toutle. Then the river flows into the Cowlitz River, which just looks like a little tributary there, but if you see it, the Cowlitz River is wider than the River Thames. Well, the Cowlitz River itself then flows into the Columbia River, which is the fourth largest river in North America, and that's a big river. It's got to be navigable for ocean shipping all the way up to Portland, Oregon. And the draft of the Columbia River was lowered to 9 feet on that day in 1980. There was a lot of dredging needed to be done to make it right. A lot of dredging needed to be done. Well, this mud flow coming down this river was devastating enough. But 5 hours later, the landslide on the north of the volcano, which was waterlogged, produced a much bigger, devastating landslide going down the North Fork Toutle River. Let me show you a video that shows you that devastating landslide, mud flow going down the North Fork Toutle River, because this is what is really dangerous about stratovolcanoes, the cone-shaped volcanoes. Not lava, it's these mud flows that causes all the problems.
But it was the debris-laden walls of water which tore down the North Fork of the Toutle River that proved most spectacular and devastating.
This is normally a little trickle, which I like to fish in. That's a house.
After wiping out an entire logging camp, the deluge raged on. In a matter of hours, this river of destruction surged under the Toutle River Bridge on Interstate 5, closing the main arterial between Portland and Seattle. Entire forests and logs, hundreds of years old, roared past stunned onlookers. From the Toutle to the Cowlitz to the Columbia River, first attempts at clearing the debris became exercises in futility. For the first time in decades, the lower Columbia River was closed to freighter traffic. The raging torrent had left its mark.
And that is my friend's house. Well, I said that the eruption produced effects that were similar to the flood. So I want to just change gears now and tell you a little bit about the flood so that you can understand why it's so similar to what happened in the flood. You see, the flood began with the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven. Those are the two things that happened at the time of the flood. They were the driving mechanism. Well, it seems to us that the fountains of the great deep refers to volcanic activity, which must have happened at the ocean basins in the pre-flood oceans. So we think that there must have been cracks in the ocean. Superheated water would have been thrown up at supersonic speed into the atmosphere, and eventually, when that water at supersonic speed in the atmosphere, eventually it would cool a bit and it would fall down as rain, and that's what we think is meant by the windows of heaven. You'll notice from this picture as well that we think that before the flood there was just one continent, because Genesis 1 tells us that all the seas were gathered in one place, so therefore the land must have been in one place. So there was one continent, one ocean, and the ocean has been completely replaced during the flood by this massive volcanic activity. So that's what would have caused the flood. The fountains of the great deep, then the windows of heaven from the water being thrown up into the atmosphere, and that's what would have produced the tectonic plates we have today. Well, evolutionary geologists believe in tectonic plates too, but they think these plates have been moving slowly, a millimetre or two a year, like they are at the moment, over millions of years. We think, however, that these plates moved very, very rapidly indeed at the time of the flood, and they would have got to more or less the places that they are now within about 45 days of the beginning of the flood, while everything was still underwater. And we call this model of how we think the flood came about, we call it catastrophic plate tectonics. And our evidence for catastrophic plate tectonics is largely here in the Pacific Northwest, where I live. So in the Pacific Northwest, where Mount St. Helens is, you'll notice that off the coast is a very small plate called the Juan de Fuca plate. Now, the Juan de Fuca plate is being pushed. There's an area just outside the plate in the Pacific Ocean where new material is coming up, and it is pushing the Juan de Fuca plate underneath the North American plate in a process called subduction. It's like this. It's going like that, one plate going under the other. The friction of that melts lots of rock underground, and it's that molten magma that eventually finds its way up to make all the volcanoes of the Cascade Mountain range. Mount St. Helens, Mount Rainier, Mount Vernon, Mount Baker, Mount Hood, Mount Adams. There's a number of Lassen Peak as well, and Mount Shasta. There's a number of volcanoes in that range, all active volcanoes, though none of them are as active as Mount St. Helens. That is the most active volcano. Well, that explains how the shape comes about, but once again, evolutionary geologists believe this took millions of years. But if that's so, how could it have generated enough heat to melt the rock? And if it had done, then after millions of years, surely the rock would have gone hard again. Well, we think that the initial subduction happened as a sort of runaway subduction, very fast indeed, at the beginning of the flood. So a huge amount of heat being generated, melting the rock, which is then did not happen millions of years ago. It happened about 4,500 years ago at the time of the worldwide flood. So it hasn't had time to solidify yet. In fact, if you look at seismic wave measurements going through the Earth, we know that inside the Earth, inside the mantle of the Earth, which is semi-molten, there is a solid piece there, which many scientists refer to as the Farallon plate. But most people agree that that Farallon plate is probably the remains of the Juan de Fuca plate, that when it was first broken up, that it's gone underneath. Well, we believe that it was broken at the time of the flood, the beginning of the flood, and that most of the Juan de Fuca plate has therefore gone into the mantle. And once again, if this were millions of years old, then you would expect that to have melted by now, but it hasn't. It's still there. And it's this effect that has caused volcanoes like Mount St. Helens. Well, that's the end of the sort of scientific bit. I don't want to complicate things with too much science, so you're welcome to ask me some questions afterwards. But the scientific information that I've just given you can be found in this 2-volume book, which is for sale on the Answers in Genesis website, written by Dr. Andrew Snelling. And that's a very, very good book indeed that tells you all about the mechanism of how the flood happened. Unfortunately, you're likely to need a degree in geology to be able to read that book. So if you don't have a degree in geology, then it may please you to know that there is a dumbed down version. The same publishing company decided to find someone much less intelligent than Andrew to write a simplified version, okay? And that's it. Okay. Now that, unfortunately, for various reasons, is not on sale here. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it also on our website, the address of which I'll give you later at the end of, but I haven't managed to get that particular book over here. Well, that brings us back to Mount St. Helens then. And I told you that's what Mount St. Helens looked like after the eruption. But it doesn't look like that anymore. It looks like this. And I want to point out to you three things that have changed radically in this picture. First of all, you can see there's a lot of green stuff. I'm going to mention that in a minute. Secondly, I want you to notice that there is a river flowing through the area. In fact, there are two rivers. You can't see one going through there, but they're joining together at that point. So water is getting through this valley again. And the third thing that's interesting there as well is the fact that this river is flowing through a very big canyon, a steep-sided canyon. Now, if we look inside that canyon, before I tell you about how the canyon was formed, I want you to notice that the canyon has revealed the layers in the volcanic debris. Now, I'm very glad that the canyon was formed then. The canyon was formed 2 years after the main eruption. But it's meant that we can see these layers, because if the canyon hadn't formed, we would not have been allowed to go in and dig down. We wouldn't have known those layers were there. So there are sedimentary, horizontal rock layers looking just like the sorts of rock layers we get elsewhere in the world. Like these in Edinburgh, Salisbury Crags in Edinburgh, where you've got these horizontal layers that they tell us took millions of years to form, and that they were formed on top of older layers there, which were worn away to that level over millions of years. Here's the thing. These rocks were studied by a man called James Hutton. And James Hutton is the man who invented the concept of millions of years. But he was wrong. And I can explain to you why he was wrong. Because this gap between the rocks, which is known as an unconformity, is smooth. You only get smooth erosion lines if the erosion takes place very fast indeed. It couldn't have taken millions of years. Otherwise, it should have been random and jagged. So we think that that set of rocks was laid down during the flood, and our evidence for that is back at Mount St. Helens. Here's the canyon. There's a lady stood at the bottom of the canyon to give you an idea of scale. It's about 100 feet high. It's a big canyon. It's like a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon, because its features are very similar. Down at the bottom is the sort of amorphous stuff that would have come on May the 18th, 1980, with the initial volcanic eruption. But then there were, in fact, 7 separate eruptions in the early 1980s. In the second eruption on June the 12th, 1980, pyroclastic flows laid down layers. Pyroclastic flows means hot gases carrying lots of dust and stones flowing across the countryside like a river, settling into layers. 25 feet thickness of layers. When you look closer, you can count about 1,000 layers altogether. So how many millions of years does it take to form 1,000 layers 25 feet thick? The answer is it took 3 hours. It took 3 hours to form that lot. And yet it looks so similar to the Tapete sandstone, which is at the top of which is in the Grand Canyon. Very, very similar indeed. In fact, at the same rate, that Tapete sandstone could have been formed in about 8 days. Now, above the 25 feet, there is a mud flow. That mud flow happened on March the 19th, 1982, nearly 2 years after the main eruption. But here's what else the mud flow did. You see, what happened is that this 7th and final eruption of the 1980s, some of the other eruptions were smaller and didn't do much, but a glacier had started to form in the crater. And so what happened is that the Great Glacier melted, and you got lots of mud flowing out of the crater, and it was flowing at great energy, carving out these canyons through the mud flow. There's the canyons that it carved out. It's a very similar pattern to the Grand Canyon. You've got side canyons, you've got the same sort of effect. Then the rivers came through afterwards. And this is important to remember. The canyons came first, then the rivers flowed through afterwards. Do you get that? And in the same way, we don't think that the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River, which I'll show you in a minute. But what I just need to mention first is that that entire river system there, which is, as I said, very deep. It's a 1/40th model of the Grand Canyon, which of course is huge, jaw-droppingly huge. So these are big. How many millions of years would it take to form those sort of canyons? And the answer is it took 9 hours. Everything was done in 9 hours. Like I said, in the same way, we don't think the Grand Canyon was formed by the Colorado River. We think that it was formed by floodwater draining off the continent at the end of the flood, or maybe after the flood, maybe trapped floodwaters draining afterwards. Now, you remember me telling you earlier about Spirit Lake having been pushed up the hillside where all the trees had been knocked down, then the water came down 500 feet and settled on top of the landslide debris? Well, it brought lots of dead trees with it. So after the eruption, there were 1 million dead trees floating on Spirit Lake. There are still 300,000 dead trees floating on Spirit Lake today. They're interesting because they get wet over time. They take in water more faster at the root end, the root ball end. They have been ripped off the roots, so the roots are left in the ground, but where the roots were, the root ball end, that's where water gets into the tree faster, which means that end gets heavier. And eventually the trees float vertically. And after they've floated vertically for a while, they sink vertically. So for 10 years after the eruption, there was sediment going to the bottom of Spirit Lake, and every so often a log would sink down, and then there'd be more sediment, then another log, and so on. And this is like the beginning of fossilization. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to go any further. It's stopped in mid-process. It's not going to go any further because Spirit Lake is not a big lake. It's now crystal clear. It's beautiful. It's crystal clear. But it's like the beginning of the sort of fossil formation we get at places like this, which is Specimen Ridge in the Yellowstone National Park. And there, the interpretive board used to say that there must have been 27 distinct layers of fossil forests over a period of 50 million years. Now, they have at least had the grace to take that notice down now, having seen what's happened at Spirit Lake. But you see, if you dig down beneath those fossil trees, you will find that they do not have roots. They don't have roots because they didn't grow there. This is not a forest at all. There aren't 27 forests there. These are trees that were snapped by the floodwaters, floating on the floodwaters, eventually turning vertical and sinking down through the floodwaters towards the end of the flood and embedding in sediment at the end of the flood. That is a much more logical explanation of how these sort of things get there. So why is it then that our interpretation of these effects is so different from that of the evolutionary geologists? Well, the Apostle Peter tells us why. Because the Apostle Peter pointed out in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4, that at the end times there will be scoffers who come, and they say things like, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. They don't expect things to happen fast. And then he goes on to say, they deliberately overlook this fact. They deliberately overlook this fact. In other words, they're deliberately ignoring this important fact. And in fact, Peter gives two facts. One, that the earth was formed out of water. God made the world. And second, the world that then existed was deluged with water, the flood. That's why they get these things wrong, because most people do not want to accept the two facts that God made the world and God flooded the world. And as soon as you understand that those two facts are true, everything else begins to fit in place. Does that make sense? That's why it's all there. Well, Mount St. Helens, therefore, can be seen as a model for the flood, so that we can understand how the flood came about. But actually, Mount St. Helens, the flood itself, I beg your pardon, is also a model for the second coming of Jesus. How do we know that? Because Jesus said so. Jesus said that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. That's what he says in Luke's Gospel. So, what happened at the time of the flood was a judgment. You see, we've talked a lot about the scientific aspects of why the flood came, but we should never overlook the fact that the reason for the flood was not a scientific reason. It was a perfectly normal, logical, theological reason. Why did the flood came? Because God says that the wickedness of men's hearts was always evil continually. That's why the flood came. The flood came as a judgment. And through the flood, there was an act of mercy, because the most beautiful verse in Genesis, in my opinion, is Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. Whenever people ask me to autograph books, I always put that verse in if they want a verse in there. Genesis chapter 6, verse 8, which says, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah was saved by grace. And in Hebrews, it tells us that Noah had the righteousness that comes through faith. So that's interesting. Noah was saved by grace through faith. Do you know anybody else who was saved by grace through faith? Here's one on the platform. I was saved by grace through faith, because that is how we're saved. Well, just to round up then in the next couple of minutes, that again is what Mount St. Helens looked like before the eruption. It was a pretty place. That's what Spirit Lake looked like before the eruption. Campsites all the way around the side there. People were able to go boating, were able to go fishing. It looks beautiful to me. I hope you agree. I wish I had been able to see that. I never saw that. Here's one of the hotels that was by the lake there. It's called the Mount St. Helens Lodge, and it was owned and operated by this gentleman called Harry Randall Truman. That's not the former president of the United States. It's a different Harry Truman. And he refused to leave. When the evacuation notice came, he refused to go. He said, there's a secret mine shaft, I'll be able to hide in that. But in any case, it doesn't matter, because if the mountain goes, I'm going with it. The area is heavily timbered. Spirit Lake is between me and the mountain. The mountain's a mile away. The mountain ain't going to hurt me. Not only that, and by the way, I've removed all the swear words from it, because he was a man of an interesting, salty vocabulary. The other thing he said was, only God can move me from this mountain. Interesting. When you challenge God like that, only God can move me from the mountain. Actually, God didn't move him from the mountain. He's still there. Here's his gravestone. But he's not there. He's not buried there. He's not buried there. He's buried somewhere by Spirit Lake. Nobody's dug down to find where his body is. That's where he is. And that's what happens if you defy God, if you shake your fist at God. That fount of all knowledge, Wikipedia, says that the 1980 event was the deadliest and most destructive volcanic eruption in the history of the continental United States of America. 57 people are known to have died. More were left homeless when the ash fell. Pyroclastic flows destroyed or buried 200 houses. That's the devastation that came about. There is a house floating away on a river of mud, like you saw in the volcano in the video. The area was so devastated that scientists said it will take 1,000 years before anything ever grows there again. That area is so devastated that it will take 1,000 years before anything ever grows there. And I can take you on a hike through those little hills, which are called hummocks. I can show you an entire ecosystem, woodlands, little streams, grass, wildlife. A lot of the regrowth is due to these pretty purple flowers. Can you see them? Tiny, insignificant flowers called prairie lupins. Prairie lupins are members of the legume family. They're tiny little ones. They're only about 2 or 3 inches high. Very insignificant. You would miss them if I didn't point them out to you. But here they are. They're legumes, which means that they make their own nitrogen. They make their own nitrates. And the whole point is that scientists thought that nothing would grow in the area because there's no nitrates in the volcanic material. Actually, they don't make their own nitrates. They grow these little nodules in their roots, which are invaded by a type of soil bacteria called rhizobia. And the rhizobia managed to get nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into nitrates so that the lupin can grow. And when the lupin dies, the nitrates go into the soil so that other plants can grow. Isn't that marvelous? Very useful. Here's the thing, though. The rhizobia can only make nitrates from nitrogen when they get special sugars that only the lupin can make. Let me just summarize what I've just said. The lupin can't live without the rhizobia, and the rhizobia can't live without the lupin. So which evolved first? Do you see, this is what's known as a symbiotic relationship. One of them cannot have evolved without the other. This is just one of the many scientific reasons why evolution, the theory of evolution, doesn't work. And it's left us with an area that looks beautiful. Here's a picture of Mount St. Helens across Spirit Lake. There's Spirit Lake, there's Mount St. Helens in the background. I think that looks beautiful. Do you agree? But hold on, I've already shown you a picture of Mount St. Helens across Spirit Lake. That looks beautiful. That looks beautiful too. Well, I would argue that this is different but still beautiful. And you know what that proves to me? It proves to me that God can make beautiful things out of things that were once broken. Just like God can make beautiful people out of people who were once broken and sinful. People like you and me, when we repent and we put our trust in Jesus Christ. These volcanoes came about because of the flood. We don't think there were volcanoes before the flood. And the flood came about as a judgment from God. So when we look at that volcano, we are seeing the judgment of God. It is an emblem of the judgment of God. That's what it means. Do you know, when I was a small boy, I remember picking up a fossil and running to my father with it and saying, "What does this mean?" And my dad said, "I don't know, go and ask your science teacher at school." And that's the wrong answer. What do those stones mean there? Do you know that God told Joshua in the Old Testament that there were going to be times when their children would say, "What do these stones mean?" The stones of witness that they had been told to gather up and put by the side of the Jordan. Remember that? And God said, "You're to tell them that shows that I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt." What do these stones mean? They mean that God is a God of judgment. That's the first important scientific fact about that. That God is a God of judgment, and therefore, and he judges sin because he's angry with sin. And just as he judged that world in the flood, so he's going to bring the world to a final end, as the Apostle Peter tells us again in 2 Peter 3, in fire. But there's a second thing that this tells us, and the second thing is because you can see that volcano, can't you? That proves that your ancestors escaped the flood. Do you know that? Your ancestors escaped the flood. Why? Because your ancestors were Noah and his family. Every one of you. This is a family meeting today. We are all related because we are all descended from Noah and his family. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was saved through the flood by grace. The ark that he was in was waterproofed against the flood by pitch. But the interesting thing is that the word translated pitch in Genesis chapter 7 is translated, it's the word kafar in Hebrew, and it's translated everywhere else in the Old Testament by the word atonement. Noah was saved from the watery judgment of God by the atonement of pitch around the ark. We are saved from the fiery judgment of God to come by the atoning blood of Jesus Christ shed once for all that never has to be repeated. Because remember, God has promised he's never going to send another worldwide flood. There doesn't have to be repetition, but one day there will be that accounting. God is a God of judgment, and he's a God of mercy and love. In which form are you going to meet him? Because the opportunity is there for you to meet him as the God of mercy. The God of mercy, who will save you from your sins if you'll repent and bow the knee and put your faith in Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for listening. May God bless you. Can I tell you just a couple of things just before I finish. I want to mention some of the products that you can see on the Mount St. Helens book table. And by the way, if you feel that you want to give to us, can I just mention, please, that you would need to, if you were making any checks, for example, please make them payable to me, because the Mount St. Helens Creation Centre does not have an account here in Britain. I need to put them through a British account. I'm going to audit them. My board know all about it. They will check up on it. It will be published on our website. You'll be able to see. Okay, so it's going to be open and above board, but it needs to be done that way, because if I get lots of checks to the Mount St. Helens Creation Centre, they cost about $20 a time to have them changed into American dollars, and that includes whether the face value is greater than or less than that. Okay. Anyway, I've got this book here called Where Birds Eat Horses, which is a very odd title explained in the first chapter. It's all about the language of evolution, how it is that the theory of evolution, or evolution as we call it here in Britain, I'll keep you getting used to the American pronunciation. Evolution is a theory supported not by scientific facts, but by their clever and deceptive use of language. So this book, which was originally written for adults, just explains how you can spot various language phrases in English, so without needing a degree in science, you can spot the false signs from the true signs. However, a lot of homeschool groups have realized that they quite like this, and so it works for teenagers, which means that I've produced a workbook. The workbook can be bought online and downloaded and printed yourself, but the book is here if you wanted that. The 6 Days of Genesis is on the Answers in Genesis website. I don't know what price is selling it for, please forgive me, it may not be that amount, okay? But I've got the DVD series on that. This is our main teaching material from our ministry as an introduction to the whole subject of creation and Genesis and against evolution. It's called the 6 Days of Genesis. It's 6 talks on the first 2 chapters of Genesis, and we've got that on our store for £43. This DVD for £11 is basically a virtual tour, a virtual excursion around the mountain led by myself. You'll come with me and a Christian school group from Washington and find out what all these things are about around the area. Don't miss the boat, although I don't have the book here, I do have the DVD. Itching Ears is about Christian doctrine, how it is that every doctrine, every major Christian doctrine there is founded on the foundation of the book of Genesis. And so that's that book. It goes through doctrines like the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture, and it shows how they all start from a basis of Genesis being true. Now, our best-selling book, our main flagship book really, is this book called Only Believe. Creation is a subset of apologetics, and apologetics is how we defend the Christian faith. And I am very concerned that many people are defending the Christian faith today in a way that is unbiblical. So I've written this book to try and help people understand a biblical method of defending the faith, which is known as presuppositional apologetics. And my good friend Cy ten Bruggencate, one of the leading presuppositional apologists today, kindly agreed to write the foreword to it. So this is an easy-to-read book that helps you understand the whole principle of how we defend the faith. And we have that on our bookstall as well. So again, thank you very much for listening. And Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. Do you want to go? Where do we fly to if we wanted to go?
You fly to Portland, Oregon.
There you go. You've got
Portland,
that.
Oregon.
Right.
And we are, in fact, going to be, later this year, we are doing a whole vacation as an experiment in August. Next year, we're hoping to widen this out and we'll advertise it. So just like people go on creation vacations to the Grand Canyon, people from next year, from 2019, will be able to come on creation vacations to the Pacific Northwest, and particularly to Mount St. Helens to have a look at that. And I'm working with a Christian travel company to sort that out. So hopefully that will be of interest to some of you.
Very good. Get saving. What I'll do first, before I tell you about a few other bits and pieces, is I'll start passing the box round, if you don't mind. The reason, as Aubrey said at the beginning, the reason why we're doing this is plain simply because Paul got in touch with me and says, you know, I'm coming over. See, grandchildren is the first and foremost over in Ireland, and could we arrange a meeting? Well, I'm pretty sure we could. So got on the blower to Aubrey. He said, yeah, I'm sure we can organise this, so that's fine. But Paul isn't making any charge for this. So this is why we agreed between us all that the offering that was taken, 100% of it, will go towards Paul and his costs for coming over and to bless the ministry back home. Okay, so that's that. Our involvement at Answers in Genesis was to promote this, so thank you for coming, and thank you if you've seen our promotional material to advertise this. And we've got a bookstall out there as well. Paul mentioned a book that he wrote, The 6 Days of Genesis, Scientific Appreciation of Chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis. And that's actually on offer. It's normally £9, we're in it for £6, so that's available there. If you want a coffee table book, a pictorial book about Mount St Helens, here we go, Footprints in the Ash, got lots of colour photos in there, for those who prefer those instead of the words. That's available, that's £10. And also there's quite a range of hardback books out there, and what we've done is that the hardback books are any 3 for 2. So mix and match the hardback books on a 3 for 2. That on its own is £10. Visually, we've got not just the tour that Paul's got on there of Mount St Helens. This was an earlier documentary DVD by Dr. Stephen Austin, which is £14. That's no, don't worry, it's not the $1 Million Man or $6 billion or whatever, Lee Majors. Not that Steve Austin. This is a different chap, and that's £14. That's a documentary that's available, and something for the children as well. This one is called Case of the Missing Mountain, and the idea is that you go through it and you crack the code and you work out what's happened to Mount St Helens and why everything has happened the way it is. So that's available. That is £6. Also, there is a DVD of Mount St Helens similar to the Steve Austin one. In fact, it features Steve Austin, again, the scientist, not the bionic man. And this one is done for young people, featuring Noah Justice, who at that time was probably about...
He was 12. He was 12 when he did that, yeah.
Whereas now I'm told he's quite tall and got a very deep voice. But nevertheless, that is something that is very suitable for young people. It's part of the